The battlefield is rarely just a stage for armies to clash, it is a silent yet potent commander, dictating the possibilities, constraints, and outcomes of warfare long before the first shot is fired. Soldiers, weapons, and strategies may capture the public imagination, but the contours of the earth, the hills, rivers, valleys, deserts, forests, and urban landscapes often determine the fate of entire campaigns. From ancient battles where the high ground was a coveted advantage to modern conflicts shaped by mountains and rivers, terrain has consistently imposed both opportunity and limitation, forcing commanders to adapt and innovate in ways that can mean the difference between victory and defeat. Understanding the role of terrain is not merely an academic exercise, it is to recognize that geography is as much a participant in war as any general or regiment. The influence of terrain begins with movement. Armies are physical entities, and their ability to advance, retreat, or maneuver hinges on the nature of the ground beneath them. Open plains offer unparalleled mobility, enabling cavalry charges, rapid mechanized advances, and the effective deployment of artillery. The speed of an army across such terrain can overwhelm defenders who are unprepared for rapid movement. Yet, open ground also exposes troops to observation and fire, requiring careful consideration of cover and concealment. Commanders must weigh the advantages of mobility against the vulnerability that the same terrain may impose. Historical examples abound. The flat plains of northern Europe allowed for the sweeping armored campaigns of World War II, where mechanized units could exploit gaps in defensive lines, but they also left advancing troops exposed to air attacks and artillery bombardment. Conversely, uneven terrain, such as hills and valleys, imposes significant tactical constraints while offering distinct advantages to defenders. Elevated positions provide observation over enemy movements and enhance the range and effectiveness of artillery. Armies occupying high ground can repel larger forces with comparatively fewer soldiers, as demonstrated in countless battles across history. Valleys and depressions, while offering concealment, can trap advancing forces, making them vulnerable to enfilade fire or ambush. Commanders who fail to account for the elevation and undulations of the terrain often find their meticulously planned offensives reduced to costly misadventures. The relationship between elevation and combat effectiveness is subtle yet profound. A hill that seems insignificant on a map can, in reality, dominate an entire battlefield, shaping troop deployments and artillery placements in ways that determine success or failure. Water bodies, from narrow streams to sprawling rivers and lakes, also dictate strategy. Rivers can serve as formidable defensive barriers, compelling attackers to engineer crossings under fire, a task that is logistically complex and fraught with danger. Bridges become critical objectives, and the timing of their capture or destruction can halt or enable entire campaigns. Marshes and wetlands, often underestimated, impede troop movement and create choke points that can be exploited by defenders. Historically, armies that misjudged the challenges posed by waterways, underestimating flooding, currents, or seasonal variations, paid dearly in men and material. Engineers, scouts, and planners constantly assess these natural obstacles, understanding that rivers and marshes could transform ordinary terrain into almost insurmountable hurdles for the unprepared. Deserts and arid regions present a different kind of strategic complexity. While open desert allows rapid mechanized movement, the lack of cover, extreme temperatures, and shifting sands create immense challenges for both attackers and defenders. Fuel, water, and food supplies become as critical as ammunition, and even minor miscalculations can halt offensives or endanger entire units. The North African campaigns of World War II exemplify the interplay of mobility and environmental hardship. Rommel's forces leveraged knowledge of local terrain and supply routes to achieve rapid advances, yet the unforgiving desert limited the duration of offensives and magnified the importance of logistical precision. Here, terrain dictated not just tactical decisions but the broader rhythm of the campaign itself, demonstrating that natural conditions can shape the operational tempo of warfare. Forests and jungles introduce yet another layer of complexity. Dense foliage restricts visibility, hinders navigation, and complicates the coordination of large formations. In such terrain, small units, guerrilla tactics, and ambushes often outweigh sheer numbers, giving defenders or insurgents a significant advantage. The Pacific theater of World War II, with its thick jungles and rugged islands, forced Allied forces to adapt with specialized units, reconnaissance, and innovative supply strategies. Similarly, the Ardennes Forest provided cover for surprise offensives during the Battle of the Bulge, illustrating how wooded terrain can conceal movements and allow smaller forces to strike unexpectedly. Understanding vegetation, elevation, and local climate conditions became as critical as knowing enemy strength, as misreading these factors could turn a simple advance into a deadly trap. Urban terrain, cities, towns, and industrial complexes further complicates strategic planning. Buildings, streets, and alleys transform battlefields into labyrinths where conventional tactics may falter. Tanks and artillery, highly effective in open terrain, become vulnerable in narrow streets. Infantry operations require painstaking coordination to avoid friendly fire and maximize effectiveness. The sieges of Stalingrad, Warsaw, and Berlin underscore how urban terrain can prolong conflict, amplify casualties, and necessitate innovative approaches. Control of high points, transport hubs, and fortified structures within cities often translates directly into strategic advantage, as these locations influence the movement of troops, the distribution of supplies, and the flow of communication. Urban terrain, in effect, reshapes the logic of conventional warfare, demanding adaptability and ingenuity from commanders. Beyond the immediate tactical and operational considerations, terrain profoundly influences logistics and supply chains. Armies cannot fight without fuel, ammunition, food, and medical supplies, all of which must traverse the environment under combat conditions. Mountains, rivers, deserts, and snowfields pose severe challenges to these supply networks, requiring engineering solutions such as bridges, roads, and air supply routes. History repeatedly demonstrates that logistical failure, often terrain-induced, can turn initial victories into disastrous retreats. Napoleon's Russian campaign and the German invasion of the Soviet Union both highlight how harsh terrain and environmental conditions can decimate forces even in the absence of direct combat. Commanders who integrated terrain into supply planning gained strategic advantage, while those who ignored it faced catastrophic consequences. Finally, terrain exerts psychological and morale effects on troops. Fighting uphill, crossing rivers under fire, or navigating jungles in tropical heat imposes physical and mental strain that can influence combat performance. Conversely, occupying defensible positions, using natural cover, or advancing through terrain that facilitates movement can bolster confidence and effectiveness. Commanders attuned to these human factors integrated terrain analysis into their overall strategy, recognizing that the environment could amplify or mitigate the psychological pressures of warfare. The silent presence of terrain, therefore, becomes both a tactical and emotional force, shaping decisions at every level of command. In sum, terrain is not merely the backdrop of military history, it is a decisive actor, shaping strategy, operations, logistics, and morale. Successful commanders study and adapt to the land with the same rigor they apply to enemy analysis, understanding that hills, rivers, deserts, forests, and cities impose constraints, offer opportunities, and dictate the flow of combat. Across centuries of warfare, from ancient battles to the global conflicts of the 20th century, Terrain has consistently proven that the ground beneath one's feet can influence outcomes as profoundly as armies, weapons, and leadership. To neglect the power of terrain is to underestimate the battlefield itself, for it is the silent commander whose influence endures long after the clash of arms has ended. Mountains, rivers, and deserts, natural barriers and strategic challenges. In the theater of war, natural landscapes often act as invisible commanders, dictating the tempo of operations and shaping outcomes in ways that no general or army could achieve alone. Among the most formidable of these natural features are mountains, rivers, and deserts, terrain types that can empower defenders, frustrate attackers, and force innovation in strategy and logistics. While troops and weapons are the visible elements of conflict, it is the environment, its obstacles and advantages that quietly governs movement, decision-making, and ultimately the course of campaigns. Mountains, with their steep slopes, jagged ridges, and narrow passes, have historically served as both shields and traps. They provide elevated vantage points, allow defenders to concentrate fire on constrained approaches, and can funnel attackers into predictable routes, making ambushes deadly. During World War II, the Italian campaign highlighted the power of mountainous terrain. The Allied advance toward Rome was slowed for months by the Apennine Mountains, where German forces had established fortified positions in valleys and on hilltops. Every attack required meticulous reconnaissance, engineering efforts to build roads and bridges, and coordination of artillery to suppress well-entrenched defenders. Even with superior numbers and firepower, the Allies faced the harsh reality that mountains could neutralize advantages, forcing protracted engagements in conditions that sapped both manpower and morale. Rivers and waterways represent another form of natural constraint, serving as both defensive barriers and logistical challenges. Crossing a river under enemy observation is inherently perilous, requiring pontoon bridges, ferrying operations, or amphibious vehicles. The German Blitzkrieg in 1940 exploited rapid crossings of the Meuse and other French rivers, overwhelming defenses, and demonstrating how speed and surprise could overcome natural obstacles. Conversely, during the Allied crossing of the Rhine in 1945, careful planning, artillery cover, and smoke screens were essential to minimize casualties while moving troops and equipment across one of Europe's most significant rivers. Rivers not only hindered direct assaults but also complicated supply chains. Bridges, once destroyed, could isolate entire units, making control of these natural choke points a critical strategic priority. Deserts present an entirely different set of challenges. Open and vast, deserts enable rapid mechanized advances but impose severe logistical burdens. In North Africa, the campaigns of 1940 to 1943 vividly illustrated how the terrain itself could become an adversary. Armored divisions depended on precise fuel and water supplies, as even minor shortages could halt movement or render units vulnerable to counterattack. Sandstorms, scorching heat, and shifting dunes added unpredictable variables to every engagement, making both navigation and equipment maintenance a constant struggle. Field commanders learned that desert warfare required a delicate balance between mobility and supply management, with any miscalculation risking operational paralysis. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, capitalized on intimate knowledge of terrain, using natural features to hide troop movements, stage flanking maneuvers, and execute surprise attacks, yet even he was constrained by the unforgiving desert that could not be conquered by strategy alone. Beyond movement and supply, mountains, rivers, and deserts also shape defensive strategies. Elevated positions, natural choke points, and vast, inhospitable expanses allow smaller forces to resist larger ones by leveraging the terrain's inherent advantages. During the Greco-Italian War, Greek forces successfully used the mountainous landscape to repel Italian advances, demonstrating that intimate knowledge of terrain could offset numerical inferiority. In North Africa, Rommel's forces dug in behind ridges and dunes to maximize the defensive potential of the desert. Rivers often functioned as artificial lines of fortification, with defenders constructing elaborate bunkers, minefields, and artillery positions to capitalize on the natural barrier. In all these cases, the environment dictated not just tactics, but also the broader planning and timing of operations, proving that terrain could shape the very logic of warfare. Natural barriers also influence reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. Mountains and deserts limit visibility and restrict movement, complicating the task of assessing enemy positions. A single ridge or sand dune can conceal an entire division, forcing reconnaissance units to adopt creative approaches, scouting along ridgelines, using aerial photography, or employing local guides familiar with the terrain. Rivers, with their bridges and crossings, become intelligence priorities, as knowing which routes are available or obstructed can determine the speed and success of an offensive. Terrain, in these ways, functions as both obstacle and opportunity. It can hide threats, delay attacks, and channel movement, but understanding it thoroughly can provide decisive advantage. The environmental conditions of these terrains also amplify the human dimension of warfare. Mountainous regions strain physical endurance, with steep climbs, thin air, and exposure to harsh weather testing both soldiers and animals. Rivers demand careful coordination under stress, where missteps can result in drowning or capture. Deserts impose relentless heat, dehydration, and the risk of mechanical failure in vehicles. Morale becomes inseparable from terrain. Troops fatigued by environmental hardships are less effective in combat, more prone to mistakes, and harder to coordinate. Commanders must therefore integrate terrain assessment with personnel management, ensuring that the environment does not undermine the combat effectiveness of their forces. Technology and engineering play a critical role in overcoming natural barriers. Bridges, tunnels, road construction, and mechanized transport are tools that can mitigate the constraints imposed by mountains, rivers, and deserts. However, these solutions often introduce new vulnerabilities. Supply lines become extended and exposed, engineering units require protection, and environmental factors, flooding, landslides, or sandstorms can render even the best prepared plans useless. In the North African campaigns, for example, the Allies' ability to move fuel and ammunition across the desert was as decisive as their battlefield tactics, demonstrating that control over terrain requires both strategic foresight and engineering ingenuity. Ultimately, mountains, rivers, and deserts are not passive features, they are active agents in warfare. They impose limits, present opportunities, and shape the conduct of battles at every level, from small skirmishes to large-scale campaigns. Commanders who ignore these natural barriers often face disaster, while those who study and adapt to them can convert environmental constraints into tactical and strategic advantages. Across history, from the Apennines and Meuse to the deserts of North Africa, terrain has repeatedly proven that it can influence not only the outcome of individual battles but also the success of entire campaigns. It is a reminder that while weapons and tactics evolve, the fundamental influence of the earth itself remains constant. In conclusion, the mountains that slow armies, the rivers that channel attacks, and the deserts that test endurance are as much participants in warfare as any general or regiment. Understanding, respecting, and adapting to these natural barriers is essential for military success. Commanders must read the terrain as carefully as they read the enemy, anticipating how the environment will shape movement, logistics, morale, and strategy. In the global conflicts of the 20th century and beyond, the lessons of natural barriers endure. Mastery of terrain is not merely advantageous, it is often decisive. Mountains, rivers, and deserts are silent strategists, shaping the course of war with a quiet but unyielding authority that no human planning can ever fully control. Forests, jungles, and urban landscapes, complexity and tactical innovation. While mountains, rivers, and deserts exert influence through scale, distance, and environmental harshness, forests, jungles, and urban landscapes introduce an entirely different set of tactical and strategic challenges. These terrains conceal, fragment, and complicate operations, demanding a level of innovation and adaptability that tests commanders and soldiers alike. Unlike open or extreme terrains, these environments are dense, chaotic, and intimate, affecting visibility, maneuverability, and even the psychology of those fighting within them. They transform conventional warfare into a delicate interplay of improvisation, reconnaissance, and survival. Forests, with their dense foliage, uneven ground, and natural obstacles, often render traditional formations and tactics ineffective. Movement becomes slow, visibility is severely limited, and coordination between units can falter under the canopy of trees. During the Battle of the Ardennes in 1944, the dense forests provided German forces with cover for a surprise offensive, allowing armored and infantry units to approach Allied positions without detection. The constricted avenues of advance forced attackers to move in column formations along narrow roads, while defenders could concentrate fire at predictable choke points. In this context, the forest dictated the tempo of operations, speed was constrained, supply lines became vulnerable, and reconnaissance both aerial and on the ground was essential to avoid catastrophic ambushes. The forest's complexity amplified human and logistical limitations, demonstrating that terrain could be both protector and predator. Jungles, particularly in the Pacific and Southeast Asia, compounded these challenges by adding humidity, heat, and biological hazards to the mix. Thick undergrowth, towering trees, and tangled vines obstructed visibility and made navigation treacherous. Traditional artillery support became less effective, as sight lines were blocked and the risk of friendly fire increased. In the jungles of Burma and New Guinea, Allied and Japanese forces faced not only enemy troops but also disease, insects, and unpredictable weather. Supply chains had to be adapted to carry food, water, ammunition, and medical supplies over rough trails or via airdrops, often under constant threat from ambush or terrain hazards. Commanders relied heavily on local knowledge, specialized units trained in jungle warfare, and innovative communication methods to maintain cohesion. These environments rewarded adaptability, creativity, and intimate familiarity with the land, turning every patrol and maneuver into a test of both physical endurance and tactical ingenuity. In both forests and jungles, concealment and deception become critical tools. Natural cover allows smaller forces to conduct ambushes, delaying actions, and hit-and-run operations that can frustrate larger, technologically superior armies. Commanders learn to exploit these features, placing snipers, observation posts, and traps to maximize the defensive potential of the terrain. Conversely, attackers had to develop new tactics, moving silently, scouting paths in advance, and coordinating with air or artillery support to compensate for restricted visibility. The interplay of concealment and detection, of movement and vulnerability, transformed these landscapes into dynamic battlefields where human skill and ingenuity often outweighed numerical superiority. Urban landscapes present yet another level of complexity, combining elements of concealment, elevation, and structural hazards. Cities and towns are fragmented, three-dimensional environments where streets, buildings, alleys, and subterranean passages create labyrinthine battlefields. Armored vehicles lose their advantage, artillery must be carefully coordinated to avoid civilian infrastructure or friendly units, and infantry operations require meticulous planning. The Battle of Stalingrad exemplifies how urban terrain can absorb and neutralize superior firepower. Every street, building, and factory became a defensive position, allowing small units to resist larger formations for extended periods. Urban combat transforms strategy into micro-tactics, the placement of snipers, the clearing of buildings, and the control of intersections become critical, often more decisive than overarching operational plans. The city itself dictates the rhythm of engagement, with combat reduced to incremental gains and high-risk maneuvers. Psychological factors in forests, jungles, and cities cannot be underestimated. Dense foliage, hidden threats, and enclosed streets amplify fear, stress, and fatigue. Soldiers are forced to operate with limited visibility, uncertain of enemy positions, and constantly alert to ambush or hidden hazards. In urban warfare, the destruction of familiar infrastructure, constant bombardment, and the presence of civilians create additional pressures. Commanders must account for these human factors, ensuring that morale and cohesion are maintained even in environments designed to overwhelm and confuse. The terrain, in essence, shapes the mental battlefield as much as the physical one, influencing decisions, risk tolerance, and the capacity to adapt under pressure. Logistics and communication are profoundly affected in these terrains. Supplying units in forests, jungles, or cities is far more complicated than in open plains or deserts. Narrow trails, destroyed infrastructure, and the necessity for stealth constrain the movement of supplies, reinforcements, and evacuations. Traditional communication lines may be disrupted, requiring messengers, runners, or innovative radio placement to maintain connectivity. Engineers often have to construct makeshift roads, bridges, or tunnels under combat conditions. In the Pacific jungles, airdrops became essential, while in urban areas, coordination relied on a combination of runners, wireless sets, and prearranged signals. The terrain thus dictates not only combat tactics but also the entire logistical framework that sustains military operations. Adaptation and innovation become central to success in these environments. Specialized units, jungle warfare divisions, urban assault teams, or forest reconnaissance squads emerged to operate effectively where conventional units struggled. Training, equipment, and tactics were modified to suit the environment: lighter gear for mobility, camouflage for concealment, and modular teams capable of rapid, decentralized operations. In many cases, mastery of terrain became the single greatest determinant of success, with local knowledge and improvisation outweighing numerical or technological superiority. Commanders who underestimated the complexity of these terrains faced delays, heavy casualties, and operational failures, while those who integrated environmental intelligence into planning achieved decisive advantage. Ultimately, forests, jungles, and urban landscapes illustrate that terrain is not merely a passive backdrop to warfare, it is a dynamic participant that influences every aspect of combat. By constraining movement, concealing forces, shaping tactics, and impacting morale, these environments test the flexibility, creativity, and endurance of both commanders and soldiers. From the Ardennes to the Pacific Islands and the streets of European cities, the lessons are clear: understanding, respecting, and adapting to the intricacies of terrain is essential to operational success. In these complex battlefields, human ingenuity interacts with environmental challenges, producing outcomes that are often determined as much by the land as by leadership, strategy, or weaponry. In conclusion, forests, jungles, and urban landscapes transform conventional warfare into a test of adaptability, innovation, and psychological resilience. They conceal, fragment, and complicate, forcing commanders to rethink tactics, logistics, and human resource management. The lessons of World War II and other conflicts demonstrate that success in these terrains depends on understanding the land as an active agent, leveraging its advantages, and mitigating its hazards. In these dense, intricate, and unpredictable environments, terrain dictates the rhythm, risks, and rewards of combat, proving itself once again to be a silent but decisive force in warfare. Logistics, morale, and legacy. Terrain's long-term impact on campaigns. In the theater of war, victory is rarely determined by tactics alone. The silent, often overlooked elements of logistics, morale, and the enduring influence of terrain frequently dictate the outcomes of entire campaigns. While mountains, rivers, deserts, forests, jungles, and urban landscapes shape individual battles, it is the sustained interaction between terrain and human capability that defines the long-term course of conflict. Armies move, fight, and survive not only on strategy and courage but also on their ability to navigate, endure, and adapt to the physical environment, and the consequences of terrain can echo far beyond the battlefield. Logistics is the lifeblood of warfare, and its success is inextricably tied to terrain. Supplying troops in hostile or complex environments demands extraordinary planning and adaptability. Roads, railways, rivers, and air corridors all become critical arteries, and any disruption can halt operations in their tracks. During World War II, the German advance into the Soviet Union was fatally hindered by terrain-induced logistical challenges. The vast expanses of the Russian steppes, coupled with harsh winters and poorly developed infrastructure, stretched supply lines beyond their practical limits. Vehicles became mired in mud during the spring thaw, and fuel and ammunition shortages paralyzed entire divisions. Terrain, in this case, was not merely an obstacle to movement but a strategic actor capable of undermining the most meticulously planned offensives. Similarly, in the Pacific, Allied forces faced dense jungles and mountainous islands that complicated resupply, requiring innovative solutions such as airdrops, amphibious transports, and makeshift trails that could sustain prolonged campaigns. Desert campaigns, too, illustrate the critical interplay of logistics and terrain. In North Africa, both Axis and Allied forces relied heavily on long, exposed supply lines across hundreds of miles of sand and gravel. Fuel, water, and spare parts dictated operational limits, and even minor disruptions could halt momentum. Commanders had to calculate the environment with precision, balancing the speed of mechanized advances with the practical limits of resupply. Here, terrain not only shaped immediate tactical decisions but also imposed a rhythm on the campaign itself, with operational tempo contingent upon the availability of resources and the ability to traverse hostile environments safely. Terrain also exerts a profound influence on morale, a factor as decisive as any weapon or formation. Soldiers' psychological resilience is tested by the physical challenges imposed by their surroundings. Harsh mountains, deep rivers, stifling jungles, or war-torn cities impose fatigue, stress, and uncertainty, while favorable terrain, defensible hills, secure urban strong points, or open spaces conducive to maneuver can bolster confidence. In prolonged campaigns, the morale of troops becomes intertwined with the land itself. Troops trapped in inhospitable terrain are more susceptible to defeatism, desertion, or operational errors, whereas those who can exploit terrain effectively feel empowered and capable. Commanders who understand these psychological dynamics often structure operations to minimize terrain-induced stress while maximizing its defensive or offensive benefits, recognizing that morale and terrain are inseparable components of combat effectiveness. Beyond immediate operations, terrain influences the legacy and long-term outcomes of wars. It shapes post-conflict reconstruction, the strategic value of occupied territory, and the lessons future commanders extract from engagements. Mountainous or heavily forested regions may remain contested or difficult to pacify long after a formal campaign concludes, influencing political control and post-war stability. Rivers that once served as defensive barriers may become critical infrastructure for economic recovery or military fortification. Urban landscapes, scarred by intense combat, require rebuilding and often determine the strategic posture of future conflicts. The imprint of terrain on history is therefore both physical and conceptual, affecting not just battles but the broader arc of warfare, governance, and human settlement. Environmental hazards, often intertwined with terrain, have long-term operational consequences. Winter, monsoons, flooding, and other climate-related conditions can compound the challenges imposed by terrain, turning even favorable ground into a trap. Napoleon's Russian campaign remains a stark reminder: terrain and climate together inflicted devastating losses, demonstrating that armies must anticipate not only the physical layout of the land but also the seasonal and environmental variables that can transform strategy into disaster. Similarly, mud, ice, and other seasonal phenomena during World War I and II slowed offensives, immobilized vehicles, and reshaped plans, emphasizing that terrain's influence extends beyond the immediate geography to temporal and environmental dimensions. Moreover, terrain fosters innovation, compelling militaries to develop new doctrines, technologies, and organizational structures. Engineers, reconnaissance units, specialized infantry, and logistical corps often emerge directly in response to environmental challenges. The creation of mountain troops, jungle warfare specialists, and urban assault teams reflects the recognition that terrain is an active opponent, requiring adaptation rather than mere confrontation. Success depends not only on mastering strategy but on integrating engineering, technology, and human ingenuity to mitigate the constraints imposed by the land. Terrain thus becomes both teacher and adversary, shaping the evolution of military thought and operational practice. Ultimately, the long-term impact of terrain on campaigns is evident in how it shapes both the conduct of war and the memory of victory or defeat. Armies that respect and adapt to the environment gain resilience, operational depth, and sustained capability. Those that underestimate it may achieve tactical victories only to find themselves undone by logistical failure, exhaustion, or environmental hazards. The interaction between terrain, logistics, morale, and innovation is continuous, a silent but omnipresent factor in the story of warfare. It is a reminder that human conflict unfolds within and is constrained by the physical world, and that understanding this reality is as crucial as any battle plan or tactical maneuver. In conclusion, terrain's long-term influence extends far beyond immediate combat. It dictates the flow of supplies, shapes the psychological endurance of soldiers, drives technological and tactical innovation, and leaves an enduring imprint on the course of wars. Mountains, rivers, deserts, forests, jungles, and cities act as both obstacles and enablers, demanding that commanders integrate their understanding of the land into every decision. The study of terrain is therefore not ancillary but central to military strategy, revealing that the geography of a battlefield is as potent as any human actor in determining the fate of campaigns. History consistently demonstrates that armies who master the challenges imposed by terrain, while respecting its enduring influence on logistics, morale, and operational planning, are those most likely to achieve lasting success, leaving behind lessons that shape warfare for generations to come.